sure you're in the right talk. My name is Ben Cousins, and this talk is called Is Your Business Model Evil? The Moral Maze of the New Games Business. Hopefully this is what the next 60 minutes should look like. I'm going to just briefly introduce myself and give you a little bit of a background, and then have a little bit of a conversation or an examination of the history of ethics in games. And then I want to go in a little bit deep into some of the ethical issues that have been brought up by people surrounding free-to-play as a business model. And then I want to try and create a list of ethical issues kind of brought up by free-to-play, and then sort of apply some of those issues against other business models in the industry, so we can get what we will hopefully could call like an ethical ranking for the entire games business. I then want to spend 15 minutes kind of concluding and thinking about some kind of next steps in this subject, and maybe we'll have time for some questions and comments here, given that this is the last session today, but we may need to kind of move it out somewhere else. But hopefully this is what it should look like. Who am I? Well, on the 11th of August 1999, there was a solar eclipse which was visible across the whole of the south of England, which was where I was living at the time. And solar eclipses have been used in history as a way of like predicting when really terrible things happen. And that was actually my first day in the games industry. Where I was working at the time, my first day as a QA tester in Croydon, at Acclaim, the solar eclipse was visible. But people in Cardiff, a little bit further away, on the very first day I was in the games industry, they noted birds falling silent, daylight colors turning shades of gray, and temperatures falling, augmented by a passing wisp of cloud. So that's what happened on my first day in the games industry. I've done a lot of different roles. There's quite a few people who are executives who started in QA, but not many of them went through content creation in the way that I did. So I started off in QA and then built levels, and then was a designer, systems designer, and as lead designer, and ended up kind of managing teams, and then founded a couple of studios, and now my title is head of European studios for DNA. So I've seen the whole industry over these 15 years. I kind of know how it works from top to bottom. And people think of me as a digital guy, I think because my profile has been higher in the last few years, but I actually spent more of my career working in the traditional packaged goods industry. I spent 8 years on packaged goods games for these kind of fun old platforms, working on a really wide variety of genres. And then I spent the last 7 years working in the digital realm, free-to-play, but also digitally delivered products like Battlefield 1943, which I was lucky enough to be involved in early on. So that's kind of, I feel like a digital guy, but there's this kind of experience early on in my career, which was around the business, which we would call like the traditional industry. Let's set some parameters, because this is a thorny subject, and I want to make it clear what I'm talking about and what I'm not talking about here. This talk is about ethics. It's not about quality. I'm not talking about what are the best games. I'm not talking about what platforms and what business models produce the best experiences by some kind of subjective measurement. I'm talking about ethics. Talking about, good or bad, good or evil, rather than high quality or low quality. And I'm only really interested in the ethical treatment of customers, because I think it's too big a subject to talk about the ethical treatment of employees, or how a given business model or a given type of company might treat its competitors in an ethical or unethical way. There's been lots of discussion about trademarking recently. I don't want to get into that. I just want to talk about consumer rights and consumer ethics. And I'm interested in relative ethics. I'm interested in comparing bits of the games industry against other bits of the games industry. Honestly, if we were to think in an absolute sense, like where the games industry itself sits ethically, I don't think we're in a particularly good space if we compare ourselves to like charity or like the education establishment or anything like that, because at the end of the day, we're producing kind of cheap entertainment for people. So I'm looking at the games industry itself and trying to find where things fit ethically within it. And the kind of big questions that I'm interested in asking are around this statement. And this is a common position that people are taking at the moment. This is like one of the standard positions that people take in the industry. They believe that the free-to-play business model is less ethical than other business models. And I want to try and find out if this is actually the case when we compare it to other models. And I'm trying to be as objective as possible, but I come from the digital realm, but I'd be interested in some of your guys' feedback on whether you think I've been fully objective when we do a comparison. And if that, and, you know, where does free-to-play sit, and why is it in that position? You know, are these people right? And if they are right, you know, why are they right? And if they're not right, why are they not right? I'm going to talk a little bit later about this concept of the establishment, and I want to kind of try and define that. The games industry shifted kind of on its axis around 2007 when the iPhone was released and when when Facebook released the API for apps. And we had these new platforms which have accelerated growth in the industry and kind of disruption in the industry. And when I talk about the establishment, I'm talking about people who've been around or who do the kind of, create the kind of products or who comment on the kind of products or who play the kind of products which were generally created pre-2007. I think you guys hopefully will understand like this dividing line between like Facebook and mobile and free to play and then console and handheld and the previous business models. Interestingly enough, the ethics of business models has been an issue within the games industry since before the video games industry actually ever existed. Did you guys know that pinball was banned for many, many years? I found some really interesting archival material here. Billboard Music Week from 1962 addressing Little Rock's pinball problem. Like, this was something that people said, we have a pinball problem in this town. On the right is some minutes from the public papers of a governor, Edward Breathitt, who was a governor between 63 and 67, and in 1966, he made the statement in his public papers that pinball is a $40 million illegal industry in Kentucky that exploits the poor and the young. Now, pinball to us feels like a safe thing, like you'd put your kid in front of a pinball machine. But it was considered in the 60s and before that a dangerous thing, a dangerous business model which exploited people. Pinball was illegal in New York City until 1976, and the guy who instigated the ban, I guess this is Fiorello LaGuardia, is the guy they named LaGuardia Airport after. He believed that pinball robbed school children of their hard-earned money, that's a familiar concept when we think about new business models in the industry now. And it feels kind of laughable that anyone would ever say that about pinball. Like, it feels like such a innocent platform, the pinball platform. And, you know, this is 1982 now, an Associated Press article which talks about some kids being charged or arrested for stealing money to play video games, to play arcade games, I guess that was. Stealing money off each other. And this was considered newsworthy, that these children were being corrupted in some way and manipulated to the point where they would steal money from their friends. Let's talk about free-to-play then. So this is the first time I'm aware of, and I've been in this industry for a while and I've been playing games for a while, this is the first time I'm aware of where the industry itself is asking ethical questions of a given business model. It's not an outside force, it's not government agencies or consumer protection. The industry itself is making ethical criticisms of a business model. And people tend to argue, I'm trying to, like, you know, boil down what people's arguments are here. They believe that free-to-play follows the following unethical process. The games bait and switch players by falsely advertising the game as free, drawing people into the experience, and then they get a small percentage of people, known as whales, in the audience to, in their mind, compulsively spend large amounts of money. And the way they do that is by using psychological tricks and aggressive marketing techniques. And the people who fall for these tricks are either adults who are kind of weak-minded in some way, or they're actually children. This tends to be the kind of position that people take when they criticize free-to-play. I really wanted to try and get the opinion of a whole bunch of people here and not just make this an opinion piece. So I spoke to people, did Skype interviews, contacted people by email, and here are some of the people that have contributed here. Jeffrey Zatkin is the chief product officer at EDAR, the independent research company. I spoke to Ramin, who works at Wargaming as an economist, and he's written some great articles about free-to-play ethics at Gamma Sutra. I referred to a great article by Mike Rose at Gamma Sutra about whales. I spoke to a guy called James Green, who works for a company called Carbon Games, a free-to-play developer. I also referred to some extremely boring documentation from the Federal Trade Commission and the Office of Fair Trading in the UK. There's been some recent investigations into free-to-play, and I wanted to feel like what was the governmental or institutional view of this subject. So let's address this first criticism that these games bait and switch players. Bait and switch is officially kind of defined by various governments, and Wikipedia kind of boils this quite nicely down. Customers are baited by a merchant who's advertising a particular product at a low price, but when the customers visit the store, they discover that the goods aren't available, or that they are pressurized into switching to a higher priced item. So, Hot dogs, $1. You go into the store, we're actually out of the $1 hot dogs. There's a $3 hot dog, though. That's the only one that's available. Or you don't want the $1 hot dogs. They're going to make you sick. You should buy a $3 hot dog instead. Now, the problem with this accusation being made against free-to-play, in my mind, is that the vast majority of people buy the $1 hot dog. So it can't be a very aggressive sales technique, and it certainly isn't preventing people from experiencing the cheaper advertised version if, for a game like Candy Crush Saga, after 400 hours of playing, 70% of the people still haven't spent any money. For me, that's evidence that there's no bait and switch. It's a very ineffective bait and switch if it exists. You know, we see very, very little numerical evidence that people are entering the game thinking it's free, but it's actually not free. Because if you guys have got as far as these people have in Candy Crush, you know that that's a lot of time and effort. And there's been plenty of pressure put on you to spend money, but people can play it for free. And for me, that proves that there's no bait and switch there. And here's, just generally across all products, this is Swerve's data from January saying that 1.5% of active players actually spent money in that month. How can you be baited and switched if only 1.5% of the people are experiencing that switch? And also, I feel like, what advantage would you get from baiting and switching a consumer? We all know that, there are high-spending players in free-to-play games, but I don't understand how, what the advantage would be for trying, someone who's willing to spend $3,000 on a game if they like it. What advantage do you get by enticing them by saying it's actually free? For me, there's no advantage to this. By advertising something as free, generally you will, the vast majority of the people that you get to play the game are the ones who are interested in playing a free game. So I'm going to dismiss this idea of bait and switch. I don't believe that it's actually an issue. But let's move on to another criticism of free-to-play games, which is that they appeal to whales. And I asked for some definitions and spoke to some of the people that I interviewed about whales. And Ramin says about whales that the free-to-play model is primarily targeting what we would call whales. And it seems to be that population is mostly made up of children and people who are prone to compulsion. And he believes that points to a problem which he thinks is very serious. Mike, in his article at Gamma Sutra, says that the free-to-play model has been proven to work best when games find and exploit whales, and he defines them as someone who spends a large amount of money on free-to-play games, essentially making the business model viable by balancing out the 99% of players who don't ever fork out a dime. James from Carbon said some interesting stuff about whales. He said that in creating their game Airmech, which is a PC-based free-to-play MOBA, science fiction MOBA, they really didn't want to make a game that fitted this typical free-to-play models of minnows and whales, and they consciously sat down and created a monetization design that they felt would prevent that from happening, so that they didn't need these high payers. They wanted to convert more people. The problem is that when you start to drill more into these definitions of whales, you reach what I would call a tautology. Ramin refuses to define whales numerically. He doesn't use numerical definitions of a whale. For him, it's more of a qualitative value. It's about how people feel when they spend rather than the amounts that they spend. And Mike said to me over email that he doesn't think it makes sense to apply a specific rigid definition to the notion of whale because depending on your income, whether you're putting yourself in trouble or not is kind of at a different numerical investment. He believes that people are whales if they're spending all of the money that they have, irrespective of how much that value is from an absolute point of view. And this is the tautology which I think is difficult around this subject of whales. People say you should avoid targeting whales. That's ethically not correct. And you say, okay, well, how do you define whales then? Well, they're the people who do things that should be avoided. There's no, don't do bad things. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to say to people. But I wasn't able to find a definition of whale which said anything other than, there's this bad thing happening and, don't do it, which is a completely reasonable argument to make. But you need to define what that bad thing is. And the numerical definition of whale doesn't work in that sense. So the issue here isn't actually high spending when you drill down to it. The issue is people spending without restraint. It's people spending money that they maybe later regret or that they're not aware that they're spending. And I believe that is potentially an ethical issue. And it's possibly related to some of the aggressive methods that people use to market in-app purchases or free-to-play items. Free-to-play games do rely on big spenders, right? The business model relies on 50% of your revenue coming from 10% of the people that spend. That's kind of the patterns that you see across the model. But it's really difficult to prove that those people whose money you're relying on are actually spending without restraint. So this coupling between spending without restraint and this numerical expenditure that people are making is very hard to prove. And we need to actually do research before we know that that's for sure. So people make a leap. If they don't like free-to-play, they make a leap and assume that all of these people are spending without restraint and they have an issue. And if you are a free-to-play developer, you tend to have contact with these people and realize that they're actually rational actors and they're not going through a compulsive behavior cycle. And I believe that even if those people exist within that whale group, they're likely a small minority, just as there's a small minority of people who buy bananas who can't stop eating bananas, right? I'm sure that happens. Now, this notion, there's also a notion that you can design a game which avoids whales. And in Mike's piece, he talks about World of Tanks, not gunning for the whales, trying to avoid whales in their products at wargaming and making sure that players can't pay to gain an advantage in battle. But there's an issue there, and that's that World of Tanks has loads of whales. This is a forum post from the official World of Tanks forums, three surveys that were run by players. Here we've got 25% of people saying they've spent over $500, 18% of people saying they've spent over $800, and 4% of people in this survey who've spent more than 1,000 euros in World of Tanks. Now, forums aren't representative of the whole audience, but even if these figures are just representative of a small proportion, a highly engaged proportion of the audience, it's still a number of people who are spending a lot of money. And Chris Keeling at Wargaming actually told me that he knows of several players that have spent 3,000 euros in the game. And their business model and their design isn't particularly aggressive, but these people are just spending. My friend Toit, who's a very well-respected free-to-play consultant who's working at Ubisoft at the moment, he's an expert in World of Tanks, and he did a talk this week about World of Tanks. He's spent 2,500 euros in the game. And he's a rational guy, right? He's not spending without restraint. And he believes that they have opened the door, probably not intentionally, in World of Tanks, to create a situation where it's possible, if you love the game and you're deeply engaged in it, to spend that kind of level of money. Going back to James, remember James at Carbon was saying with AirMech, they didn't want to create a game that had this model of free-to-play minnows and free-to-play whales. They wanted to avoid that, and they tried to create a design that avoided that. What happened, I asked him. It was a total pipe dream. You think you're going to do that? They've built a very fair system which they thought would create a flat spending curve, and they've got guys spending $1,000 in their game. And James doesn't even understand what they could possibly spend $1,000 on. The very fact that there is no spending cap on the product just invites people who are deeply engaged in the game, who are deeply engaged in the community, for whom it's a hobby, to spend a lot of money. And as he says, as we spoke more, he said people have just got this different amounts of disposable income that they're comfortable with parting with. And he uses this analogy, which I think is the best analogy for free-to-play whales. These are people who are deeply engaged in the game as a singular hobby. Their life is about playing AirMech. That's where they spend their free time. And everyone's got a passion. It might be a hi-fi system or cycling or golf or something like that. And everyone spends a lot of money on their passion. And we just have to realize that some games are people's passions. And if you have no upper spending cap, you will invite these people, even if you don't create a game mechanic which requires this kind of behavior. Another kind of ethical question that's been brought up, and this is something that Ramin has talked about, is that most of the whales are children. And he said he had evidence from EDAR that 80% of mobile game users have kids who play games, and the 22% of those kids have made unauthorized purchases. And Ramin believes that this kind of proves that a lot of the whales on mobile are actually children. Most of the whales are actually children. And this is the research that he referred to. This is showing the slide from the EDAR presentation, which shows that 22% of mobile gamers with kids, their kids have at some point spent without permission. Unfortunately, when you go to EDAR, they don't support this. The people who did this research, believe that Ramin's interpreted the data wrong. Because the next question asks, these children that have made unauthorized purchases, how much did they spend in the course of an entire year? And 68% of those children spent less than $20. Now, $20 is by no people's definition, over the course of the year, a whale. That's not a serious spender. On a mobile game, you'd have the average expenditure in a day would be $20. So our PPU for a day would be $20. This is a very, very small amount of money to spend over the course of an entire year. And Jeffrey makes this very important point that if you're making unauthorized purchases, someone's going to find out about them at some point. And a true whale is spending over time. They're engaging with a game for a long period of time, 6 months to a year. And this kind of behavior, unauthorized purchasing, can't go unnoticed for this period of time to any significant degree. The Federal Trade Commission have made a complaint about Apple and the way the App Store works, and they've made some changes to this. But the problem that the FTC have brought up is that once you enter your password in the App Store, there's a 15-minute window beyond that point where you don't need to re-enter your password, either to download a new app or to make a purchase or to make an in-app purchase. And the FTC believed that this was causing a problem with unauthorized purchases from children. And they believe that also many of these games are inviting children to obtain virtual items without realizing that they're actually spending real money, because there is an abstraction between the virtual currency and the real money that's being spent. So this seems like a legitimate complaint. The problem is when you dig into the Federal Trade Commission and how big a problem that they believe it is, they've forced Apple to refund at least $32 million to parents in the United States related to this issue. And that seems like a lot of money. And people were reporting this, like Apple is forced to spend $32 million to refund these unauthorized purchases. The trouble is, the lifetime sales from the App Store is $20 billion. In the last year, the sales for the App Store were $10 billion. And around, say, $6 billion of that is from the USA, if you kind of look at some of the data. So the FTC have gone through this long process of research, and they believe that unauthorized purchases from children only represents 0.5% of all App Store sales. This can't be considered a significant problem. It is a problem that we should address, but we can't say that I don't believe that we can say that there are any companies that are relying on unauthorized purchases, or this represents a legitimate path to profitability. But let's say that maybe the FTC are wrong, they did their research wrong, and actually EDA's number are better. So there's a whole bunch of assumptions that you make. Look at the population of the US, the percentage of them that are adults, and the percentage of those that have cell phones, and the percentage of those that have a smartphone, and the percentage of those that are iOS devices. You eventually boil down to children, the number of children that have made unauthorized purchases of 7.3 million instances. And if you get the average unauthorized purchase data from EDA, then that's $20. So that gives you an unauthorized purchase level of $147 million, which is significantly more than the $35 million that the FTC have asked for. But still, that's only 2.4% of all of iOS revenue. It's still a drop in the ocean. This isn't a significant amount of revenue from the iOS App Store, which is coming from unauthorized purchases. So I really think that we have to kind of throw away this concept and just abandon this idea that most of our whales are children, or that children making unauthorized purchases are a significant proportion of the revenue for free-to-play games. There's just nothing that supports that. It's just such a small issue when you look at the overall global revenues. No company could rely on these kind of 0.5%, 1.5% kind of proportions. I do agree, though, that like unauthorized spending is an issue, and we need to fix it, and I believe that some of the FTC and Office of Fair Trading recommendations actually make sense. But let's say, some of the ethical issues that have come from this section, and let's use these and say, okay, that's a legitimate concern, and we'll keep these in our back pocket to apply to the other business models. Spending decisions. Pushing spending decisions at under 18s could be considered unethical. Those under 18s spending without parental consent could be considered unethical, and encouraging unlimited or very high spending could be considered kind of a slightly dodgy thing to do. Not allowing refunds so that people who regret purchases, not allowing them to roll back if they're unauthorized or regretted, that could be considered something which is unethical as well, I think, given these complaints. So let's talk about one of the other criticisms that people make, that the marketing of in-app purchases or free-to-play purchases are actually aggressive. And Raman talks about coercive monetization, which is where you give people incomplete information, or you don't give them access to all the information that they need to be able to make a fair choice around a purchase. You look at the Office of Fair Trading, and they're particularly looking at children, but they believe that the commercial intent of the product needs to be clear. They believe that games shouldn't mislead customers by making them think that they have to spend money when they don't have to spend money. And they also don't want practices which are considered aggressive, like exploiting children's vulnerability or inexperience or credulity. But the Office of Fair Trading is only really interested in the children problem, not particularly the adult problem. Trouble with this idea of coercive monetization and aggressive in-app purchases is that when you look at the data for people who've spent money, are you happy with your purchase? Do you believe that you've got value for money? The numbers are actually pretty good. 78% of people who've spent $50 to $100 on mobile games are pretty happy. They feel like they've got value for money. And 67% of people who spent more than $100 are happy that they've got value for money. Now, you could argue that there's still, a significant proportion of people who don't feel like they've got good value for money. But it's hard until you compare to another business how many people who've spent $100 or more on a watch or a pair of shoes feel like they've got full value for money. It's difficult to know without making a benchmark to other industries, I think, in this case. But still, the majority of people seem perfectly happy with the purchases that they've made. So how can that have been a coercive process to kind of force them to spend against their will or to trick them to spend when they seem pretty satisfied? But let's at least, acknowledge some of the ethical issues from this section. Putting pressure on people with like a time-related or a limited availability offer. This is one of the things that people say is problematic with free-to-play. Buy something now. This is your one only chance of buying it at this reduced price. Limited availability or limited time. Special offers, that kind of thing. Pushing people to repeat spend with kind of random drops. That get a chance for a rare item. Keep opening these crates until you find the rare thing. That's one of the criticisms that people make of free-to-play, is kind of in terms of an unethical mechanic. And also appealing to emotion is something that the Office of Fair Trading bring up as a problem. Your dragon is starving. And this is actually, there are games out there that say this. Dragon is starving, give us some cash and your dragon will survive. So let's acknowledge some of these issues. Let's try and build an analytical model based on some of these criticisms that we've found. Remember, this is the question I'm trying to answer. Is the free-to-play business model actually less ethical than other business models when we compare it using a system or an analytical tool rather than just thinking about it from an emotional point of view? So I've created a model, and this enables us hopefully to take a fresh look at all video game business models. Let's imagine that these are new models that we're just encountering and that we're seeing them for the first time, and apply a list of some of the concerns that have been addressed by the critiques of free-to-play to these other business models and see where everything sits. And try and create a scorecard. So here's my scorecard. The first thing I ask is, are purchase decisions for this game aimed at under 18s? And you get a score, right? You get a -1 or a +1, whether you're being ethical or unethical. In this game, is it easy for an under 18 to spend without parental approval? Can the consumer play the game before they spend? How much information do they have about the game before they spend money? Are independent reviews available before they spend? So is there like a third party that can give you a sense of whether this is quality or not? Are there things like time-limited offers or random chance or emotional appeals that are driving purchase decisions? Is the minimum purchase under $20? Why do I choose $20? Well, that's the average monthly pocket money for, money for a 15-year-old allowance for a 15-year-old child in the US. So, can they buy something with less than the pocket money that they get for a month? Is the consumer able to spend over $240, or in other words, an annual pocket money allowance for a 15-year-old? And also, can you easily get refunds? Is there some kind of rapid mechanism for getting refunds without resorting to a class action lawsuit or to calling your credit card company and getting a charge back? And that gives you a total. So let's look at all the business models, really. There's the coin-operated arcade machine. There's products like traditional packaged goods games. There's subscription products. There's the free-to-play model. There's free games with ads. There is the early access model, which is a new model which is coming up where you get access to a game before it's finished. And then there is crowdsourcing. Let's go through some of these and let's see if we can find a score based on that ethical scorecard to see where these products hit or these business models hit from an ethical point of view. Coin-op then, you will observe in a track mode for a coin-op game before you choose to play it, or you'll see someone playing the game and you'll get a feel for what the game's about. And then you spend a small amount of money to start playing, and then if you make mistakes, you've got to spend more money to keep playing. Spending, it gets harder to avoid spending over time. These games get harder and harder and harder. You know, the amount of time you have to finish a stage in Outrun gets shorter and shorter and shorter as you play the game. Spending is unlimited, and there's no refunds available in an arcade. Have fun trying to go to the owner of an arcade and ask for a refund. That's not going to happen. Some of the issues there is you can't try a coin-operated game before you buy. There's no way of trying that. There's no demo mode in these games. And there's a pretty aggressive monetization in a coin-operated game. Like, you know, 10 seconds, 9 seconds, 8 seconds. You want to put your coin in to continue your game. There's unlimited spending. You can potentially put as much money as the coin holder can hold in a Pac-Man machine is the amount that you can put into it. So Pac-Man, aimed at under 18s, yep. Easy to spend without parental approval. Yeah, you just need a handful of coins in your pockets to play Pac-Man. The consumer can't play the game before spending. There's independent reviews. You can talk to the guy who last played it and ask him if it's fun or not. There are time-limited offers and kind of aggressive monetization in arcade games. The minimum purchase price, though, is under $20, but the maximum purchase is over $240. No refunds. So Pac-Man ends up with an ethical score of -4. It's not a particularly good score, I have to say. Let's talk about products then. For these kind of games, you can read or watch an independent review. Sometimes you can play a demo, but that's becoming less common nowadays, and you pay quite a large sum to start playing, $60 to start playing. And then, you know, there are limited edition collector's editions available. I think there's a $260 collector's edition for Titanfall available for people who are really excited. Generally, there's no other purchases, although sometimes DLC is available for these types of games, and there's no refunds available, right? There's no way of getting a refund for a game you don't like under this model. That's kind of an interesting thing to think about. They stopped that a long time ago because people they felt were exploiting it by playing a game and then taking it back and getting a refund. Some of the issues then, you can't try these games before you buy them if there's no demo. They have very aggressive launch hype and marketing, which is designed to build you up into a frenzy so you feel that you have to buy this game to be part of this cultural moment. The amount of times I've bought a Grand Theft Auto game just because all my friends were buying it, I don't like Grand Theft Auto games. It's amazing that I've done this over, you know, I wanted to be part of the gang. There are such things as kind of time-pressured, unethical marketing practices for these types of products. I believe that Steam sales are sitting on the borderline of what's acceptable in terms of marketing. There's lots of people talk about how they spend a huge amount of money when Steam sales are live, and a lot of those people never get around to playing those games. These games tend to have a high price of entry when you look at them compared to other types of products. So let's look at Mario 64. As an example of like a classic product-based game. It's aimed at kids, although it's very difficult for a kid to buy that without parental approval. You can't play the game before you spend the money, but there are independent reviews. There's no time-limited offers. It's a pretty transparent business model. The minimum purchase size, however, is kind of high, but you can't spend a lot of money on Mario 64. It's one game that's $60 or whatever. Can't get a refund for it, though, if you don't like it. So that gives it an ethical score of 0. Let's talk about subscription then. In subscription, again, you can read or watch independent reviews of the game. Maybe you can play a limited version of an MMO before you commit to spending money. But most often, you'll need to spend quite a large sum to start playing a traditional MMO like World of Warcraft, and then there's a monthly fee to keep playing this game. You've got to pay money every month if you want to keep playing. There's no refunds available for this model at all. And some of the issues that we have there is that, again, you can't try before you buy often. These games have very aggressive launch hype and marketing, particularly the expansion packs for World of Warcraft, where you really feel like you want to be in that world. You know, when Mr. Pandaria comes out, everyone wants to be in that particular part of the game and doing that activity. It's very aggressive. High price of entry, a very high price to continue playing. You can spend hundreds of dollars on subscription MMOs over the course of time. Talking to Jeffrey at EDAR, who was working in the MMO business, a lot of MMOs will deliberately make it kind of difficult to cancel your subscription, a bit like the way a gym makes it kind of difficult to cancel your fees. And there were some MMOs in the early days where you had to talk to somebody on the phone to cancel your subscription. There was no automated method that's canceling your subscription back in the Wild West of early subscription MMOs. Sometimes additional DLC is pushed on consumers. So the actual upper spending limit on MMOs is actually, in many cases, as high or much higher than the average free-to-play game. So World of Warcraft at launch, I think you could say it's aimed at kids. Very hard to get a subscription MMO account up without your mom and dad involved. Generally, a launch for World of Warcraft, you couldn't play the game without spending first. There were independent reviews available, but the whole concept of a subscription is a time-limited offer. Like, you've got to spend your money, otherwise you can't play the game. That's a time-limited offer in its essence. Minimum purchase size was over $20. You can spend more than $240 on that game, and you can't get refunds. So they get -4 for World of Warcraft at launch. Free to play, you play the game for free. There are optional in-game purchases. It gets a lot harder to avoid purchases over time. Anyone who's played Clash of Clans will know that that level of upgrading your town center takes a very long time. It's very hard for you to play these games for hundreds of hours without spending money, even though lots of people do that. Spending is unlimited. For me, the definition of a free-to-play game is that there must be an unlimited spending opportunity for consumers. Refunds are possible on some platforms, though. On Google Play and on iOS, you can get a refund. Just last week, I refunded myself the in-app purchase to unlock Smash Hits cloud saving mode, just as a test. And that was a completely transparent process. I was able to get a full refund for that. It's not the case for all free-to-play games, but certainly on mobile, you can get full refunds. Issues there, some people might think the game's completely free. There are aggressive marketing techniques for some of the things that you spend money on. You can spend unlimitedly on free-to-play games. Candy Crush Saga, then. I think you could say it's aimed partially at under 18s. Apparently, according to the FTC and the OFT, it's relatively easy for these kids to spend without parental approval, but you can play the game before you spend any money. And there are reviews available. Before you download the game, you can see a star rating for Candy Crush Saga. But there are time-limited offers and random chance. There are some of these more kind of aggressive marketing techniques within Candy Crush Saga. But the minimum purchase size is quite small. It's under $20, even though the maximum purchase size is over $240. But you can get refunds easily. It's just as simple as going to your iTunes account and saying, I'm going to report that expenditure, and you give a reason, and then it just will be refunded to you. So Candy Crush Saga gets an ethical mark of 0. Free with ads. I don't know if you guys have heard of this game. It's called Flappy Bird. It's kind of an obscure indie game. It's not very popular. In ad-supported games, they play the game for free, and there is advertising in the game. And that's the entire business model. You look at ads. The only ethical issue I could consider with this is that the ads may be pushing product on children. You may be exposing children through this type of game to an advertisement for a product. And in a lot of countries in the world, directly targeting children with ads is actually illegal. But let's look at Flappy Bird. The purchase decisions are aimed at under 18s, but then it's straight ones all the way down to the bottom. So they get a total score of 6. It's the best score ethically so far. Is this kind of, we think of it as a kind of a trashy business model, but when we measure it against the free-to-play complaints, it actually comes out very well. 2 more business models. One is early access. In this, you spend a sum to play the game. The game's incomplete, so it couldn't possibly be reviewed because the game's not finished yet. There's no further purchases. So I believe that this game's going to be interesting. I'm going to give the developer some money, but it's not finished yet. No refunds are available in this model. On Steam Early Access, you can't get a refund in Steam under the official system. Maybe if you push them hard and hard at customer service to give you a refund, but there's no official refund system in Steam. Issues with this, and is you can't try the game before you buy it. Sometimes the games are kind of expensive, and you're buying an incomplete product. You've got no way of knowing if they're going to realize the potential that you see from the product when you spend your money on it. One of these products, then, Divinity Original Sin, actually comes out fairly well, though, by these. It's not aimed at under 18s. You can't buy something on Steam without parent approval. That's pretty difficult. You can't play the game before spending, though. There's no independent reviews because the game's not finished. You've got no way of knowing what you're going to get in the end. There's no kind of time-limited offers or anything like that, though, in these products. Divinity Original Sin is above $20, but you can't spend more than $240 on it. But there's no way of getting refunds. So these guys are sitting on 0 with this product from an ethical scorecard point of view. Finally, I want to talk about crowdsourcing, typified by Kickstarter. The important thing about Kickstarter is all of the information about the product pre-purchase is non-independent. This is controlled. The communication flow is controlled completely by the developer. They're able to tell you anything, and there's no checks and balances on that communication flow. And you can pledge kind of small amounts, or you can pledge extremely large amounts against this pitch that you get from a crowdsourced games, even though generally there's no further purchases after you've made your pledge. There are refunds available on Kickstarter, but the Kickstarter terms of service say contact the developer. So if the developer is okay, they might just give you the refund, but there are class action lawsuits, I think, being instigated by people who feel like they haven't got value for money from a Kickstarter campaign. So the issues here then, you can't try the game before you buy it because in most cases it's just concept art. You can't play concept art. There's no independent reviews. The communication flow is completely controlled by the developer. They can say what the hell they like. There are some aggressive marketing techniques. The Kickstarter itself is on a time limit. So if you want to get involved, you've got to get involved within this window that's been created. And on some of the spending tiers, there are limited offers. You want the $100 tier with the limited edition figurine, there's only 5 available. And they will push that to you in the spending area on the right-hand side of the screen. The maximum possible pledge for Kickstarter in the US is $10,000. And it's very common for a Kickstarter to have a tier that high and to get money from that tier. And of course, as we know, the product may never launch. There is no guarantee in this process that you will get your product. And you may need to resort to legal actions to go through the kind of typical consumer protection legal process. It's not automated to get refunds within Kickstarter. And I want to talk a little additionally about this. I looked at like 10 to 15 quite famous games Kickstarters. And I found that on average, 10% of the pledges were contributing 50% of the revenue of the total pledge amount. That was just 10% of the pledges, of the spenders. And I would probably bet that the conversion rate of unique users who hit that each appeal, the amount of those guys who spend money is about 1 to 5%. And this kind of got me thinking, that really reminds me of another business model. Toy, being the expert in free-to-play, makes it clear a healthy free-to-play title gets 50% of its revenue from 10% of its spenders. Hewitt Swerve, 50% of revenue in January on mobile came from the top 10% of spenders. So Kickstarter has a completely different business model to free-to-play. It's aimed at a different target audience. It's a completely different mechanism, but it follows exactly the same minnows and whales structure that free-to-play monetization does. But the interesting thing is I've never seen anyone say that Kickstarter is unethical because of this uneven spending distribution between the lowest payers and the highest payers. The fact that people are spending $10,000 on a Kickstarter is never considered a manipulative or coercive, the result of a manipulative or coercive process. And that's very interesting. I want to kind of address a little bit of that later on. Strike Suit Zero then, one of the Kickstarters, not aimed at under 18s. It's hard to spend on a Kickstarter without parental approval. You can't play the game before spending. You can't have an independent review because it doesn't exist. There is time-limited offers. The whole concept of a Kickstarter is based around this kind of quickly before the opportunity runs out, spend some money. Minimum purchase sizes are generally small for Kickstarters, but also you can go huge. You can go over $240 easily pledging on a Kickstarter. Refunds are difficult, so they actually end up with an ethics score of -2 for this particular Kickstarter. So let's look at a scorecard then. Let's see where everything sits. And I've differentiated some of these business models and had multiple versions of them so we can see how this fits. And I don't want to go into them in detail. But down at the far end, we tend to have the slightly dodgy business models aimed at kids start to score kind of badly. If there was a kids crowdsourced game, you imagine that? Like, you think it's easy to pull the wool over the eyes of a consumer, a normal games consumer, in terms of a Kickstarter. Imagine if that was like kids. That would be a pretty easy thing to exploit from an ethical point of view. Sitting at -2, we have some interesting ones. An adult $60 game with a subscription after that, which has no demo, sits down at -2. An early access game that's aimed at kids. Crowdsourced games for adults sit down here at -2, kind of nearly at the far end of the bad ethics area. Sitting at 0, we've got like some of the early access stuff. We've also, interestingly, at the bottom, we've got kids free-to-play games on mobile. Sitting there at 0, along with a collector's edition product, like a Titanfall collector's edition. Sits there at the same ethical level as a kid's mobile free-to-play game. That's interesting. And then starting to go into the positives, we've got like a demo, a collector's edition with a demo, a $60 product, typical $60 product which has no demo attached to it, but like a typical kind of Assassin's Creed or something like that with no demo. Adult mobile free-to-play games sit alongside a lot of these traditional business models. And then sitting up at 4, the only one we've got there is a traditional $60 product which has a demo, so you can try before you buy. And then at the top, 6 and 8, we've got the free games with ads, according to like this measurement system I've created. Adult free games with ads being the most ethical model. interesting thing here is, like I say, kids' mobile free-to-play games, according to this system, score as well as a kid's product. Mario 64, with no demo, sits at the same level as a kid's mobile free-to-play game, and that doesn't fit with the way these people talk about these models. An adult mobile free-to-play game sits better than a kid's early access game, which comes in at under $20, and that's kind of like a Minecraft-style game, which we would consider, taking it from an emotional point of view or a subjective point of view, we would consider that kind of an okay model. But according to this measurement system, there are some pitfalls there, which, from an ethical point of view, which aren't there for an adult mobile free-to-play game. So when you apply these ethical questions that have been kind of pointed at free-to-play to all of the business models, I do think you see some quite surprising patterns. We've got some business models which are considered benign, and those tend to score quite badly. And some of the game business models that are under ethical attack actually end up sitting next to some of the more reputable kind of traditional business models. It's kind of interesting. So what's happening here? Why is free-to-play under fire? I just want to finish by talking about this a little bit. See how I'm doing for time. I want to go back to this notion of the establishment. People who form their opinion of what a game is, or whom play the types of games which were established around the 2007 tipping point in the industry. I believe that there's a few different elements here, but the first element is the shock of the new. When something's new, like a free-to-play business model, people fear the worst. The establishment fears the worst. This is a disruption. It's a new thing. I don't understand it. It feels like something's going to be bad here. But generally, over time, when those problems don't occur, or whether research is done, or whether there are tweaks made to that model and the quality products rise to the surface, generally the shock of the new falls aside. The telephone was considered dangerous. The jukebox was considered ethically dangerous. There's a lot of things out there. Rock and roll was banned in many states of the US in the 50s. But over time, people realize that it's not as bad as they thought it was, and the shock of the new subsides. But what's interesting is that there are some new business models out there, actually newer than the free-to-play model, that seem to get away without this fear of shock of the new, and I'm interested in why that is. There's an element of snobbery. Free-to-play games tend to be popular with a new audience, the very young, the older, a female audience, and they're also very popular in non-Western territories, right? It was invented in Korea, it's huge in China, it's massive in Japan. So I think there's an element of the establishment, the Western establishment, saying, that game isn't really for me. That's not how I define games. That's not a proper game. It's not a real game. These other models, which are newer than free-to-play, and are kind of, you could argue, dodgier from an ethical point of view, they tend to target a more traditional gamer. Oh, that's a game for me. Okay, I kind of let those guys off because that game looks kind of cool. That appeals to me. That's not for other people to play. And I think there's an element of snobbery. It gives people an opportunity to criticize something if it's not for them. There's also something called the outsider effect, I think. The developers of these products and the publishers of free-to-play titles tend to be outsiders compared to the establishment as well. Never mind the consumers, the developers are outsiders. There's a whole bunch of Nordic countries that have suddenly become really good at this model. They were never successful in other business models. Asian companies are coming over. And people from a non-games background, from a web background, have started to be successful in these new business models. Younger people. And if you don't personally know people that are working on something, and that's new, it's very easy for you to assume the worst. It's been interesting to see how people reacted to King's trademarking issues. Now, I know the guys that run King, some of the founders and the guy who runs the company, and I think it's easy to say, oh yeah, King, that thing over there made by those guys over in Europe, and they're new, and I don't know any of them, and they're probably evil. If you know these guys, you know that the process that goes behind these decisions isn't what you think it is. And I think interacting with more people who are from a different world from you really helps you kind of recognize that everyone's thinking through the same thoughts and are driven by the same motivations. Nostalgia is an element here as well. Generally, if you're in the establishment of any kind, you want to protect your definition of what your business is about. A real game. People talk about real games, and generally when people say real games, they're kind of saying maybe this is the sort of games I played as a kid. When games were defined when I was a teenager or a child, and that's what games are about. Or they think of a golden age of games, and that's what a real game is, and they want to protect that. And free-to-play games really don't respect the history of gaming. They're one of the few business models which came out of nowhere, and the way that they're designed and the way that they're operated and the way that they target people and the platforms that they reside on really don't respect the history of gaming. And I think that kind of annoys people a little bit because they're not appealing to nostalgia. There's definitely an element of fear which is happening now. We can say for sure that by participation, the free-to-play business model is the biggest in the world. There are more people playing free-to-play games than any other type of business model. And I think that by sales revenue, we're a few years away from, just a few years away from free-to-play being biggest from a gross sales point of view as well. And of course, if you're part of the establishment, it's kind of scary that your business may be either disrupted or diminished or actually become smaller in real terms as a result of this enormous growth, and that's kind of scary. These other newer models, like crowdsourcing and early access, are actually not growing as fast. They're much less threatening. They're just kind of sitting there kind of in the background, and they're not coming in and advertising all over the TV and getting in your face, and your mom isn't playing them, and these companies aren't IPOing or anything like that. And there's a notion also of artistic aspirations. As a business model gets older and more mature, people think about it more artistically. And many people in the establishment believe games are kind of art. This is a constant discussion that people really want games to be taken seriously as art rather than as business. And free-to-play games sit gameplay and monetization right next to each other in the experience. And for a lot of people, I think that's sacrilegious, like in a literal sense. It's like putting a hot dog stand in the middle of the Sistine Chapel. It's like some way it's adding dirt to the beautiful painting. And most of these new business models might have aggressive marketing of digital sales, but that's taken outside of the game. A Kickstarter is separate from the game itself. There isn't this kind of sacrilegious meeting of two separate things, gameplay and monetization. There's the game, and then there's the Kickstarter. Even if the Kickstarter is turning a lot of the same screws and using a lot of the same techniques as the least ethical free-to-play games. Here's an interesting notion. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't know this. Many journalists will get their traditional games for free. They'll get a nice press pack sent through the post to them for reviewing Halo Reach. So all of their games come for free that they review. If someone asks them to review a free-to-play game, that actually might end up being more expensive to them than a $60 product, because maybe they're not able to expense those expenditures in the free-to-play game. Maybe they're not given free currency to enable to be able to experience what it's like to spend money in this game. So you actually end up with an experience which is completely contrary to what the consumer sees. The consumers see an enormous advantage in the game being free. But if all the games you review are already free, they just appear on your desk in a gold master or in a press pack, it's very difficult for you to kind of imagine what it would be like if it cost you money. This is an interesting one which hadn't occurred to me until I started to think about this subject. The stakes are massive in free-to-play now. We're talking billions of dollars at stake here. And there's really fierce competition between free-to-play companies. And I believe that there is a sense that some companies could start to attack their competitors in order to gain an advantage, to market their products as being, we're the ethical free-to-play games. We're not like those guys over there, those bad guys over there. Think about how the Body Shop marketed itself in the 80s as being the only cosmetic products that weren't tested on animals. This kind of approach is becoming a marketing technique for free-to-play games, and that, I think, is unnecessarily bringing up issues which don't necessarily exist. And this whole process actually reminds me of a quote which is often attributed to Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, but there's no evidence that he actually said it, and that's that first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And I believe that this is kind of applicable to these new business models, in particular free-to-play. And I've been in the free-to-play business for a while. I know the years when this happened, right? First they ignore you was in 2006. Nobody really knew what this business model was in 2006. It was happening over there in Korea, and there was just nothing in the Western world, really, of any significance that was using this model, and people totally ignored it. The Virtual Goods Roundtable in GDC 2006 was like 8 guys sitting in a room going, hey, how you doing? And you can't get in there now. You have to queue up today like 20 minutes before the session starts to even get in the door for that roundtable. Then Farmville, 2009. I brought out Battlefield Heroes in 2009. That was a period where you get laughed at. oh, look at these ridiculous free-to-play games. This is never going to amount to nothing. They're stupid. This is like a downgraded version of a real game. It was a kind of, you were a figure of fun if you were producing free-to-play games in 2009. But now I think that we're in a particular location where the stakes are higher, and these huge companies are coming out of nowhere and taking over huge swathes of people's time and people's money. And I believe that, we're following the cycle. Like, if you're in the new business of free-to-play, people are fighting you. It's literally a fight because of this amount of threat that's suddenly come out of nowhere. But of course, the final part of this is then you win. And winning may be considered like when your revenues are bigger than the traditional industry, and I believe that around 2017 we're going to have the free-to-play business bigger than the rest of the games industry. But as I was filling this out, I kind of thought, I didn't like this. I don't want it to be about winning. I think there's a more constructive approach. I just want to finish by talking about what I think should be the more constructive approach that we take to these ethical issues that are being brought up. What should we do? I think we need to start being objective, and I'm starting today by saying, like, I'm a free-to-play guy, and I'm trying to be objective here and constructive, and put my emotion aside and look at things from a structural and an analytical point of view. And I think that people need to start doing that. Reach out to people in the free-to-play business, or if you're in the free-to-play business, reach out to someone who's in the traditional industry and realize that we're all game developers at the end of the day. We're all here at this conference, but there are two different tracks of people. I know a bunch of traditional guys, but very few of those traditional guys know people that are in the new industry, the post-2007 industry. And I believe that like meeting and introducing yourself and getting to know people from the other side of the industry will help you understand that there isn't dodginess happening, there isn't unethical stuff happening. I think we do need to do real research, particularly into free-to-play. I would like to see some real independent research done to determine, are these whales all regretting their purchases? Are these whales all in some kind of a psychological state that you can measure or observe? I would be quite happy for that to happen because I believe that that's not the case. But I think there are also people on the other side who would like to see that happen because they would hope it would prove their suppositions. And I believe that there isn't enough independent research being done into free-to-play monetization. We're researching, there was addiction research in the 80s and 90s in the games industry, and violence, the effect of violence is being researched quite a lot, but we haven't yet got into that point where free-to-play is mature enough that we need to start looking into just exactly what is going on here. I believe that reviewers have a responsibility. I just want to talk about that a little bit. I think a lot of games journalists, when they review a game, don't really want to admit that what they're doing is a consumer recommendation. Like, the review score is, should I buy this game or not? I think a lot of the time it's considered a kind of a critical essay about a particular piece of art. But I think most consumers consume game reviews as a product recommendation. Should I buy a BioShock Infinite? Well, yeah, it got 9 out of 10. Of course I'm going to buy it. That's how most people engage with a review. Free-to-play game reviews don't do that. You very, very rarely get a review of the monetization. Anyone can download Candy Crush Saga in 5 minutes and play it. We don't need a review of the gameplay, but we need a review of what you're going to get yourselves into if you start spending money in this game. What is it good value for money? If you compare Candy Crush Saga to Jelly Splash, which is the better value for money as a consumer? How do you compare those in-app purchases? What's the gradation of them? And I feel like we need, there are people out there who've started to do this, but I feel like reviews of free-to-play games need to be a review of the monetization, not a review of the game, because anyone can try the game. And just generally, I just feel like we need to come together as an industry, stop infighting, stop feeling like there's a division between the pre-2007 world and the post-2007 world. And we need to come together as an industry. Because as games gets bigger and bigger, to be billions of people playing games rather than tens or hundreds of millions of people, we're probably going to get even more eyes looking at us from a government or a consumer protection point of view. People are going to bring up the violence debate again. People are going to wonder about engaging kids in these games. And I think that we need to work together as an industry and come back together and stop criticizing the other side and being part of a faction and be like we used to be in the old days, one industry which kind of stands together and huddles itself together and defends itself against those attacks from the outside. Thanks very much for your time. Thank you. We've got mics here at the front. This is the last session of the day, so maybe you want to get on. But if people do have any comments or questions, I'd love to talk about this subject. Yeah.
Hey, Ben. When you were talking about the different metrics for ranking, you made me think of one, and I was wondering what you thought out of that. For I think you call it box goods or
product
goods. Yeah. I was thinking, is an advantage there that you can sell back the games or trade them to your friend, or even for Steam games where you could share it with your family now. So does that bump the score up if you had that category?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the used games business just defines the actual price of entry as probably lower than $60. It's still above $20, but like if a lot of people, I think, make that mental calculation of this is $60, but I can probably get a $20 credit for it in a week's time. So it's actually only cost me $40. And I actually considered the impact of that, but I didn't feel like the impact of that was great enough that it would be considered like a refund. And it's also, it's not an easy thing to do, right? To kind of, I don't think it's necessarily particularly easy to get refunds or to sell your game on or to...
It's easy to give it to someone.
It's easy to give it to someone, yeah, sure. But it's easy to sell it secondhand. But I didn't feel like that was enough of a solution to that I don't like the game problem for it to be considered okay.
Right. Nice.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Please come to the mic if you've got something to say. So that, because this is being recorded for GDC Vault and they want to be able to hear the question. Hello.
This is more of a comment surrounding some of that data. So I work at EDAR, and I conducted that survey.
Great.
And as part of the survey, we were also interested in why people churn out and why they don't play a game. And interestingly, even the groups that spend that really high amount of money, so like that $150, $200 on a game, when you ask them why they churn out of a game early or they don't play it, they'll still say a lot of times that one of the top reasons is because that they don't want to pay the in-app purchase, so they're not interested in that in-app purchase. And the idea there is that it's not a compulsion. It's not that you can't not pay for that product, but that you go in, you make a decision based on the quality of the game and decide whether it's worth your money to continue in that game.
So it's a rational process of, is this value for money?
Yes,
okay.
Exactly.
So people, yeah, okay. They're not churning out because they love the game, but they hate the monetization. It's more a case of, this game isn't value for money. I've hit that paywall. I'm not going to participate.
So there will be whales in some experiences. They will spend that large amount of money in some experiences, and then in some experiences they'll say, no, this game isn't fun enough. I'm not going to make that money. Make the conscious decision to leave.
I'd love to get like a map of like typical psychological processes that consumers go through as they hit these things. Like, why do you become a $2,000 person? Why are you a $5 person? Why are you a $0 person? And I don't think we have a sense. That's probably some of the first research ever done into that kind of justification or rationalization of why people bounce at that point or why they do spend. Right. That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing. Great. Anything else? Yeah.
Thanks very much for the talk. I think it was really interesting.
Thanks.
I was just interested why you kind of avoided, I think, one key area, though. And I think the major hang-up that people have with free-to-play isn't necessarily anything to do with the things that were talked about in the talk, but just the fact that somebody with the most money can win. And I think, so it's the whole kind of pay-to-win element of it that I think is the element that I think is the one that we need to address about the ethics, really.
I talked about this, I think 3 GDCs ago when I was working on Battlefield Heroes. We went through this whole process of we didn't want to have pay to win in the game, and then we researched the audience and realized that they did want pay to win in the game, and then we put pay to win into the game, and no one left the game, and our revenue doubled overnight. For me, it's like it's a little bit, I kind of addressed it a little bit with that sacrilegious concept. I think that one of the other sacrilegious things is to affect game balance by monetization. But there are a whole bunch of pastimes, some of them competitive, where you can do exactly that. Expensive golf clubs are better than cheap golf clubs. They don't make you a better golfer than a really good golfer who's got cheap golf clubs, but they do give you an advantage. I'm a competitive cyclist, and like a 2-kilo lighter bicycle makes you faster going uphill. So for me, it's like a mental shift of not thinking about a game as chess, and analogous to a game like chess, which is completely constrained and all of the rules are completely fixed, and more like one of these more equipment-based competitive activities, like amateur car racing or golf or tennis or sailing or something like that. And it's like a mentality shift that I feel like we might get to the point where we realize that, okay, that's another type of video game, even if it isn't. It is clearly a disruption or a bastardization of what we considered games like in the past. So hopefully that kind of answers my angle on that. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Hi. Your scorecard is a great idea, and I was wondering what your reasoning is behind not weighting the different options, because everything is +1. But
Yeah.
some things like coercive tactics, marketing, aggressive marketing in games, seems like that might be weighted more strongly than the other stuff.
I would love someone to take this to the next step. And I've written articles before, and research students have taken the concepts from them to like actual rigorous academic levels. And maybe there's an argument that someone needs to do that. And maybe the free-to-play industry needs to come together and pool a little bit of cash to enable a research group within a university, someone independent, to start doing this kind of thing. And I think that would be great. It would help the whole industry to have an independent kind of ethical scorecard for a business model. If you're producing a product, you can say, are we going to upset people with this, either upset consumers or upset governing bodies or consumer protection organizations?
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I had a quick question about the Kickstarter and crowdfunding model that you mentioned. A lot of Kickstarters are now launching with the ability to have playable demos of games. Obviously, not all of them do. And a lot are starting to extend their fundraising past the limited time. So they'll keep PayPal open for rewards tiers or have other funding options available on it. Did you consider that in your ranking system of them? Or was that too far off to the side?
I think that's, it's difficult to know where to slice and dice. I just wanted to take a standard Kickstarter typified by like the majority of them. There's a lot of Kickstarters out there that show video of gameplay, and I just don't understand why they don't give the consumers themselves access to that playable code. For me, that seems like a really good way of enhancing the buzz around the game. It might not be particularly fun, but whenever I see video gameplay, I just wonder to myself, why is there not a link to a Unity demo or something like that I can play on my PC, for example? So hopefully that will be the next step of trying to ensure that there's less refunds, to give people access to all of the information about the product, including the playable demo and the prototypes and everything. I think that would be really good. Okay, thanks. One more question, and I'm losing my voice as well.
Excellent. I'll grab that one more question then. Thank you for applying a structured and analytical perspective to this and presenting hands-on tools. I got to thinking, after you critiqued the critics, perhaps there's a dimension you didn't mention, which is the material sport aspect of especially PC gaming. A larger monitor with a better resolution, a better update speeds will help you. Better graphics card will certainly help you. Many games certainly incentivize you powerfully to get better equipment and pay outside of the game experience, but within the general ecosystem. Do you have any comment on that?
I did, there's I had 2.5 hours of material or something that I had to cut down, but one of the things I talked about was how much of a whale you can be, even within a fixed product like Counter-Strike, because you can get a $300 mouse if you're a competitive Counter-Strike player. There's mouse mats that cost like $100 for these products, special keyboards, low latency monitors, all of these things. You can actually, a lot of traditional games, even with a $60 spending ceiling, there's extraneous, some of it licensed and some of it just related products that you can really bump up your spending to be several thousands of dollars. Think about Microsoft Flight Sim and all those guys who've got like 10 monitors and SLI cards and everything. There's plenty of instances where whales aren't officially enabled by the business model, but that people continue to spend money anyway because they just love it. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing it up.
Include an image of someone boxing in World of Warcraft for the next iteration.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Well, thanks very much for your time and for sticking around for questions, guys. It was really fun.